In the heart of a busy zoo, where laughter and voices intertwine with the sound of hurried footsteps, an extraordinary scene unfolds, defying logic and species boundaries. When a father gorilla, weighing hundreds of pounds, stares immobilized at his 3-week-old baby, no one knows what to expect. So until the unexpected happened, a man with shaking hands and a racing heart risked his life to save the little gorilla, while his father watched in silence, with an intensity that was not one of threat, but of pure concern. What happened at that moment? A miracle of life and connection, an instant of empathy that transcended any difference between human beings and animals. And in the midst of this fight for survival, all eyes were fixed not on the gorilla, but on the caretaker. What happened after that no one could have predicted. Let's find out. It was a typical spring day at the zoo, with families strolling around and children pointing at the animals in their cages. The sound of everyday life, mixed with the bustle of laughter and conversation. However, that day, the zoo would become the scene of something far beyond the usual routine. Everyone's attention was captured by a scene that none of the visitors could have predicted. In the gorilla enclosure, a huge adult gorilla stood still, looking intently at the small body of its cub, which lay motionless on a blanket. What seemed like a simple moment turned into a silent confrontation where the fate of a life hung in the balance. Miguel, the experienced zookeeper with over 20 years of work at the zoo, quickly approached the baby gorilla. He knew the situation was serious. The cub was weak, just 3 weeks old, and its future was uncertain. With his hands shaking with nervousness, Miguel knew that every second counted. He knelt down next to the cub, now wearing blue guantes, his stethos still hanging around his neck. The adult gorilla's gaze was fixed, but it was not hostile. It was a look full of fear, of an ancestral concern, of a father who feared for his son's life. What no one knew was that, in that small resuscitation action, not only did the baby gorilla have a chance to survive, but a unique and profound connection was forming between the man and the gorilla, something that would forever change the outlook of everyone there. Miguel didn't hesitate. He knew what he needed to do, but the pressure of being faced with such an unexpected and extreme situation made him feel a weight in his chest that he couldn't ignore. He had trained for emergency situations. He knew how to act quickly, but he had never ever done that in front of a gorilla father. And there he was, kneeling, with his hands firmly pressing the little gorilla's chest, trying to bring that fragile, vulnerable being back to life. The adult gorilla, huge and silent, still watched with his deep, shadowy eyes. Miguel's every movement was followed closely, as if the gorilla was evaluating every action, every gesture. The sound of Miguel's heart seemed to be the only noise, muffled by the tension in the air. The audience, curious and silent, was so close to the bars that they could feel the tension in the environment. The air was charged with an energy that was almost palpable. They were all watching, but no one knew what to do other than wait and hope. Miguel knew the puppy was in critical condition. He had been born weak, and all signs indicated that his chance of survival was slim. But he couldn't give up. He had prepared himself for moments like this, but no amount of training could prepare him for the pressure he felt in that moment. He had to save that being's life, not for himself, but for everyone who depended on him. The little gorilla, without strength, did not react. Every compression, every forced breath seemed to be in vain. But Miguel couldn't stop. He felt a wave of despair wash over him, a feeling of helplessness. What else could he do? It was so small, so fragile. He quickly looked at the adult gorilla, waiting for some kind of signal, some movement, but the gorilla didn't move. He just watched. Suddenly, the adult gorilla stepped forward. The ground shook slightly and the wind grew heavier. Miguel noticed the movement, but didn't look away from the puppy. He knew that any mistake could be fatal. I couldn't do anything but continue, focused on what I was doing, on each precise movement. The adult gorilla stopped. He stood still, watching. His eyes were intense, fixed, but there was something more there. It wasn't anger, it was fear. Fear of losing your puppy, fear of something irreparable happening. It was the universal fear of any parent faced with the possibility of losing their child. Time seemed to drag by. Seconds became minutes. Each compression, each breath that Miguel gave the puppy seemed to last an eternity. But then, finally, There was a reaction. A slight movement, a spasm, something minimal, but enough for Miguel to know that the puppy was still alive. His heart raced, adrenaline took over him, but he couldn't lose his calm. He concentrated again, repeating the process with precision. The adult gorilla, which had remained motionless until then, made a subtle movement with its head, as if it were analyzing its progress. Miguel felt it. He didn't know if the gorilla understood what was happening, but there was something in that look that seemed to say that the gorilla understood the fight for life that was taking place there. The cub, weak and powerless, made a sound, a small moan. It was a fragile sound, but it was the most beautiful sound Miguel had ever heard, a sound that meant life. He looked at the cub, his eyes moist with emotion. He had succeeded. The cub was coming back. It was breathing. It was surviving. The audience burst into applause, but Miguel didn't hear it. All he heard now was the sound of the little gorilla's breathing. He looked at the adult gorilla, who was still watching, but now with a different expression. It was as if a weight had been lifted from his shoulders. There was relief in the gorilla's eyes, and at that moment Miguel understood that he had achieved something much more than saving a life. He had gained the trust of a father, of a being who was not human, but who felt the same pain, the same fear, the same hope. With his hands still shaking, Miguel slowly walked away, feeling the weight of every second he spent there. He knew nothing would be more important than that moment. Nothing would be more transformative than the silent connection between a man and a gorilla, between two species that for a moment shared the same goal, saving a life. The silence that followed the collective relief was stronger than any applause. The cameras continued to capture every second, but no one was really watching through the screens anymore. All eyes were on the adult gorilla, who was now approaching with softer steps, as if wanting to ensure that his cub was okay. The tension, previously palpable in the air, now dissipated, but something else had formed there, a deep connection between beings from different worlds. Miguel knew that it wasn't just the puppy that had been rescued at that moment, but something bigger, something that he couldn't fully explain, but that he knew would never be the same after that experience. The adult gorilla, which had previously been imposing and protective, now approached cautiously. His big eyes never stopped watching the caregiver, but there was a respect there, something Miguel never imagined he would see. How could a human being achieve this? How had he gone from a mere figure of authority to an equal, a momentary companion in the struggle for life? The baby, still fragile, was slowly wrapped in the arms of the mother gorilla, who arrived calmly, with a tenderness that seemed to contradict her immense strength. Her gesture was delicate, as if she knew that the little one, still vulnerable, needed protection, but also warmth. Miguel remained on his knees, watching. He had nothing else to do there. His mission was accomplished, but he couldn't move. I couldn't leave that place. The adult gorilla, who had previously watched silently, now moved away a little, allowing the mother to care for the baby. He maintained his posture vigilant, but his attention turned to the caregiver, with an intensity so great that it seemed almost human. Miguel stood up slowly, taking great care not to make any sudden movements that could disturb the gorilla family. He knew he was still being watched, but he was no longer a passive observer. He was being evaluated in the same way the gorilla had been evaluated during the rescue. The audience, which had previously been ecstatic, was now completely silent. Many did not understand the depth of what they had witnessed, but they felt it. They felt that this was not just a spectacle. This was real. It was life, vulnerability, fear, hope. It was all rolled into one moment, and no one could just move on as if it were just another ordinary day. Miguel looked at the surrounding spectators. Some had watery eyes, others had their hands over their mouths in an effort to contain their emotions. They were all processing what they just saw, but contrary to what he imagined, no one was talking. There weren't enough words to describe the depth of it, and that somehow comforted him. He didn't need applause. He didn't need recognition. He had done what needed to be done, and the sense of accomplishment was beyond any award or external recognition. He had connected with something much bigger. The adult gorilla, still watching, took a step closer, and Miguel realized he was so close he could feel his breathing. The gorilla's gaze softened, and for a brief moment, It seemed as if he was saying something to Miguel, something that transcended words. It wasn't a threat, nor an aggressive gesture. It was a recognition, a silent agreement between two creatures who, at that moment, were more similar than different. A moment of mutual understanding. Miguel, without taking his eyes off the gorilla, made a small gesture with his head. It was not a formal greeting nor a sign of respect. It was a response, an acknowledgement that at that moment, the barrier between species had disappeared. The adult gorilla didn't move away, but he didn't come any closer either. He stood there watching, as if he was waiting for Miguel to recognize him back, for him to accept that life in that moment was something sacred. Time passed slowly, and the audience began to move again, but no sound was as impactful as the silence that had filled the space. People moved away, some still absorbing the scene, others already starting to disperse, but Miguel stayed there for a few more minutes. He knew it would be remembered, but not in the way people imagined. He didn't want to be remembered for being the hero of that day. He wanted that moment to be remembered for the connection, the simplicity, the humanity that had found each other, even without words. The cub was now in its mother's arms, breathing more calmly with a more regular rhythm. The adult gorilla looked at Miguel once again, and then finally walked away, leading his family into the enclosure. He didn't look back, but Miguel knew the connection had been made. He didn't need anything else. There, in the middle of the zoo, where the world seemed so far away, something deeper had occurred. The zoo, little by little, resumed its routine. The audience, which until then had been enveloped in respectful silence, now began to disperse. The hurried footsteps, conversations, the sound of cameras and laughter filled the air again, but something had changed. The scene of the father gorilla and his cub, the fight for life and the silent empathy between species, remained engraved in the memories of everyone present. Miguel, although physically exhausted, was still immersed in his thoughts. He walked through the zoo's hallways with heavy feet, feeling the weight of the moment. What had happened there was indescribable. The interaction between him and the adult gorilla, the silent exchange between them, felt like a story that transcended the limits of human understanding, as if two souls had recognized each other in a fleeting instant. But he knew he wouldn't be able to explain this to anyone, not even his fellow veterinarians. After all, what he had experienced could not be explained, it could only be felt. Upon reaching the concrete bench where he usually rested, Miguel sat down. His hands were still shaking slightly, not from fear but from overwhelming emotion. He closed his eyes for a moment, trying to process everything that happened. What he had done was something he never imagined experiencing in his entire career. He had risked his own safety, his own life to save a baby gorilla, but it wasn't just that. He had, without knowing it, become part of something much bigger. As the sun began to set, casting its last golden lights over the zoo, Miguel got up and went back to the gorilla enclosure. There, he saw what he already knew would happen. The adult gorilla was there, with his family. The cub, now breathing more heavily, was in its mother's lap, still fragile but surviving. The father gorilla, who previously looked like an imposing figure, was now calm, with a look of protection and care. He seemed, for the first time, relaxed. The tension in his muscles had disappeared, and the posture of constant vigilance had given way to an almost paternal serenity. Miguel approached cautiously. The adult gorilla was still watching him, but in a different way. It was as if, at that moment, the relationship between them had transformed. There was no longer fear, nor distrust, just mutual respect. The caregiver, without thinking much, slowly crouched down, placing his hand on the fence towards the gorilla. He knew he shouldn't cross the limits. He knew that the gorilla had his space and his family, but at the same time I felt like I was no longer a stranger there. He was, in a way, part of that small circle of life that was forming in the room. For a few seconds, nothing happened. The adult gorilla continued to watch. The silence that surrounded them seemed even deeper now. It wasn't the uncomfortable silence at the beginning, when everyone was tense. It was a silence of understanding, of acceptance. The gorilla then lowered his head slightly, a gesture that for Miguel was more meaningful than any words could express. It was as if he said without words, "You did what you were supposed to. You helped save my son, and for that, now, you have my respect." Miguel smiled almost without realizing it. He didn't need anything else. I didn't need thanks. There was no need for grand gestures. The gorilla's simple act of recognition was all he needed. At that moment, he understood the power of silent respect, of empathy that goes beyond physical, emotional, and even species barriers. He had been witness to a moment of pure connection, something human beings often forget they are capable of experiencing. The baby gorilla, still in its mother's arms, looked at Miguel, its small eyes searching for something. Maybe understanding, maybe curiosity. But most importantly, he was breathing. He was alive. And at that moment, Miguel knew that the cub's future was guaranteed, that he would have the chance to grow up, to become a strong and healthy gorilla. Life, somehow, had won. Miguel took a step back, keeping his hand on the fence. The adult gorilla stood up and, with one last look, walked away with his family. They disappeared into the vegetation of the enclosure, their heavy and silent footsteps mixing with the sound of the nature that surrounded them. Miguel stayed there alone for a moment, still feeling the gravity of that encounter. The scene he had witnessed, the experience he had lived, was not something he could tell in words. That connection, that moment of truth, I didn't need anything else. The zoo has resumed its routine. People left, the lights went out. But for Miguel, nothing would be the same again. He had learned something that day that few can understand. That true strength is not just in saving a life, but in understanding the value of connection, mutual respect and compassion. The world, as different as it was closer than he ever imagined. Life at the zoo ran its course, as always. But for those who were there that day, for Miguel and for everyone who witnessed the silent fight for survival of a baby gorilla, nothing would be the same. What seemed like just another ordinary spring afternoon turned into a profound lesson in empathy and humanity. From that moment on, the zoo was no longer just a place for observation. It was a space where the boundaries between species became blurred, where true connection didn't need words, just gestures. Miguel, upon returning to his routine, realized that something had changed within him. He became more than just a caregiver. He was a guardian of lives, but more than that, he had been part of something much bigger than himself. The connection with the adult gorilla, the mutual understanding and silent respect they shared that day, marked his journey in ways he could never have predicted. He understood that, no matter how much he prepared for emergency situations, nothing had prepared him for the emotional depth of saving a life in the face of another who, despite not being human, shared the same concerns, the same fear, the same hope. The now stronger baby gorilla would grow up under his mother's watchful care, while the adult gorilla would remain the relentless protector he always was. But somehow, they all carried a new perspective on what really matters. Life is not just about the fight for survival, but about the ability to connect, to understand, to feel. And perhaps this is the true essence of what it means to live. Miguel would never forget the look on the adult gorilla's face, the silent gesture that said more than any words could express. He knew that, at that moment, not only the cub had been saved, but something much deeper. The respect between a human being and an animal, the certainty that when life is at stake, barriers disappear and, for a moment, we are all part of the same story. A story of empathy, connection, and, above all, life. When we went out into the street, the sun was already setting on the horizon, painting the sky with warm golden tones. Miguel looked at the zoo one last time, and without needing any more words, he knew that he had been a witness and part of something unique, something that would remain engraved in his heart forever.